Hi everyone, welcome to this Stylization in Animation, a panel with Pete Docter panel. I'm Ian Fales from beforesandAfters.com. I'm a visual effects and animation journalist, and certainly in the past few years I've noticed a real shift, you could say, towards stylization in animation. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Now, before we get there, a quick word about the chat during this session. I'd really love all of you to let us know where you're from. You can do that right in the chat box there. And also that's where you can ask some questions for the panelists, and I'll pass those questions on to them during and at the end of the panel. Now, stylization, what are we actually talking about here? We thought we'd show you a video just to get an idea about the kind of stylization work that Pixar has done recently, and then we'll meet the panelists. So first to the video. Right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Hopefully we didn't lose any of our panelists. That video was so great to give a bit of insight into what Pixar has been up to. I'm going to let each member of the crew introduce themselves. Pete, seeing as your name is on the panel, how about I start with you?
Hey, how's it going? Okay, wait a minute. What's going? Is it working? Can you hear me?
I think
professional show business. Hi, I'm Pete Docter. I was the director of Soul and have worked at Pixar for, well, since 1990. So it's been a while, and I mean, obviously didn't start it or anything, but I've seen a lot of stuff happen along the way, which I'm happy to talk about.
Thanks, Pete. Deanna?
Yes, hello. My name is Deanna Marcellese. I'm a character art director, also an animation sketch artist lead. I've been at Pixar for almost 10 years this coming January. I've worked on a handful of features, and I've worked with Pete, Inside Out, Incredibles 2, Toy Story 4, most recently Luca.
Awesome. I feel like because we're not revealing all the panelists, it's like a big surprise every time we bring someone on. David. As David pushes the button.
He's trying to figure. There it is.
All right. I'm David Ryu. I was VFX supervisor on Luca and on Coco. I've been at Pixar for 20 years. I've done lots of different things, from crowds and sim and effects to things that are like pure software, and I decided to talk about stylization.
Thanks, David. And Ian, another Ian on the panel.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Ian McGibbon. I was the director of photography on Soul. Before that, let's see, I was director of photography on Finding Dory and a short called Bow, and I've been at Pixar for 15 years. So I'm also really excited to talk about stylization. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ian. And also Bill.
There he is.
It's working. Yes,
Yay.
it's working. Hi, everybody. Bill Wattrell. I'm a effects supervisor. Been at Pixar since 2006. And most recently, I worked on Soul with Ian and Pete and Dina.
Awesome. Now, I think we've got all our panelists together. I'm going to start with the first question, and it's going to go to you, Pete, again, because you know your name's on the panel. I feel like
okay.
we're talking here, I guess, about stylization, but in some ways, what we're talking about is the move away or a different approach than photorealism. I wonder if you could talk about that from your perspective. You know, for so many years, Pixar's been making things photoreal, or at least look real. And now I wonder, are you going in the other direction?
Yeah, well, I guess the way I look at it is from the beginning, I think artists have been trying to capture the world around them. But because we are fundamentally emotional creatures, as are all animals, so far as I can tell, it seems to me that when we look out into the world, we try to capture what we see. It's really interpreted through how we feel. So when you see a sky and it feels moody and oppressive, or you do rather, you might exaggerate and accentuate certain things to capture that feeling. I bet prehistoric man wasn't thinking about stylization when they did cave paintings. They were just trying to capture how they felt about the world using the tools that they had. And with computer animation, of course, the start of it was really the result of math, trying to capture the way light works and surfaces are described and so on. Now we're getting to a place, and we have been for quite a while, this isn't like something that's just brand new, but we're able to use the same kind of things that we do in other art forms, poetry, music, painting, to really try to capture that sense of what we feel about something in the visuals. And it's a pretty exciting place. I mean, the sort of, I guess, long ago, like John Lasseter would say, well, it has to be all story driven. And I think to some degree, I agree with that, but then there's also a sense that, you know what, just the way these sort of fundamental choices are made early on in a film, I think have an effect backwards on the story itself. And so they're all kind of this two sides of the same coin or egg, or I don't know, whatever shape I'm describing with my hands here. Anyway, I'll shut up now because I'm sure a lot of you guys have wise thoughts on this.
Well, what about you, Deanna? What's your take on that side of Pixar's work that's moved towards more stylization?
I mean, I really have to echo Pete here, especially what he said about story influencing the art, but the art influencing the story as well. My primary goal as a character designer is believability. I want the audience to truly believe these characters have always existed. They've been here living their lives all along, and we're just getting to telling their stories now, you know, and they will continue to live on even after the end credits roll. And there's a lot of different avenues to believability, and for some that's realism, and that's valid. But I think that more and more at Pixar, we are guided by feeling. And for me, stylization is a unique combination of design choices that elevate and accentuate the feel of the story being told, the feel that the story evokes.
Yeah. No, and Ian, from a DOP's point of view, is that sort of how you feel about the difference between stylization and photorealism as well?
Exactly. I mean, I couldn't have said that better, but like, we're constantly finding the story, and until like with Soul, it was a journey of kind of understanding Joe and what his story was, and then once we had a better idea of that, then the style kind of fell into place. Well, that makes it sound easy. It was a process over a lot of months. And then, you know, with Soul, we have two styles to contend with. And how do those two styles thematically support the story? That was kind of what was most, you know, kind of most important from an artistic standpoint. But, you know, there's the emotion, the feeling that you want to get through lighting, what style supports that. And it's just a process of like figuring out, you know, thematically, how do we best tell the story?
Yeah, and David, I'm guessing you've overseen completely kind of photoreal visual effects in these films and much more, you know, magical stylized ones. Where are you at with the body of work and that stylization versus photorealism idea?
I mean, I think if you look at the history of it, you know, like as Pete was saying, I think when we started out, we were just trying to figure out how to make images, and photoreal is like, it's a target, right? It's a thing to go after, and it was so hard, and we fought so hard to kind of figure that out and get there. And I think kind of just now, like it's exciting, right? Because like we have kind of command over that, I think in a way that we didn't 5-10 years ago. And so we can kind of do things where we like go after kind of these stylistic goals, these things in the images that just support a tone or a feeling in a film, but also extract out like the amazing richness, you know, like the good things about like bouncing light around and all that stuff. Like we can actually try and like kind of get both things. Like that's, I think it's, so to me, like it's a pretty exciting place and time right now.
Absolutely. Bill, what are your thoughts as an FX supervisor on that?
I think in general, for me, it's really fresh in my mind, but I really feel like Soul is this super cool example of taking, you know, the stylization that we put into things and kind of, like Pete said, pulling the emotion out of it. And I think Soul is such a good example because, like Ian said, we have these two disparate stylizations crammed into the same movie. And they're both supporting an emotional thing that Pete was striving for in those sections of the movie, right? And to think about it from a technical standpoint, just with a little bit more of an effects hat on, it feels to me like what we're doing most of the time, this isn't always, but most of the time, when we're trying to achieve some level of stylization, it's what do we need to throw away from reality that's unimportant information to help accentuate the emotion that we're looking to highlight. Effects, that's a huge thing because you throw away detail and the viewer starts to not believe what they're seeing on the screen as much as we would hope they do. So that, and I believe that's true for all the other departments too, character design for sure, but everywhere, right? You throw away some level of detail and it's a really fine line that you start walking between what is the viewer going to believe and take without questioning, and what are they going to question? The second they question, we've lost them. They're out of the film, right? So it's this very, very careful balancing act that I feel like we all have to struggle with stylization. And I think Soul, I was not responsible for a lot of it, so I'm going to say this without ego. I feel like Soul was a really, really beautiful balance of that with characters and with the lighting and with the set design. It's really interesting to see the way jazz was brought in to the real world and the way this ethereal kind of non-specificity was brought into the Soul world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that perspective, guys. I wanted to remind the audience that you can ask questions in the chat window there. There's a special section. We've got some great ones coming through already. But back to you, Pete, just for a second. I'm sort of curious, say with Soul, it ended up being a film that I felt, you know, worked on both levels. That it's stylized, but everything has that realistic feel. Do you know in your head what you think the movie is going to look like at the beginning? Do you know whether you're going to go for a stylization feel or a more realistic photorealism feel? How did it work on Soul?
For me, I have a visual in my head, but it becomes better all the way along through the collaboration of working with all these other people. You know, it's I always, as a kid, and I've said this before, I had this idea that the way it worked was geniuses like, Walt Disney or Miyazaki would just wake up one day and go like, Dumbo, and it would be fully formed in their head, and they would just like tell everybody exactly what it was and how it should look. And really, the reality is, even for those guys, having met Miyazaki and read tons about Disney, they, like us, are finding little scraps at a time. It's like putting down one puzzle piece and you're like, okay, what does the rest of the puzzle look like? Well, hey, look, that could fit here. So the whole thing is constantly evolving, and maybe the puzzle is the wrong word because or analogy, because it's not like it pre-exists. It kind of sometimes feels like that. But anyway, my point is it evolves and changes and grows based on who you're working with and how the story goes. So the answer is yes, there's an idea in my head, but it turns out way better because I get to work with people who are way more talented than I am in a lot of different areas.
Well, in Soul, one of the things that ended up being very stylized was the character shadows. And I guess, Ian, I want to turn to you about those and how they might have been formed in your mind. What kind of involvement did you have in making those shadows look that stylized way?
So I assume what you're talking about is for the actual Soul characters, like 22 and Joe, Soul Joe. Yeah, no, that was an interesting process, and it's just like Pete said. Like everybody kind of we for about 6 months we had really, really, really intense development on the look of the Soul characters, where everybody from the art department to various technical departments were essentially spitballing different ideas so that we could put all these ideas on the board and then kind of figure out what we liked about the different ideas. We ultimately, after 6 months, we kind of returned back to what are we trying to achieve? Like what's important? We kind of and Steve Pilcher, our production designer, came up with this very drawing of 22 and Joe, and he was like, there's a rainbow in them. Like we want them to be full of color and life, and this is about the potential of who these souls are, or in the case of the mentors, it tells the story of a little bit of who they were. We're like, okay, that's cool. Rainbows are cool. How do we shape these characters? Like we need to be able to show their performance and their faces and everything. And so we use that concept of a rainbow to kind of show kind of a form and light. So on one side where you would have the highlight, you would start with the warmer end of the spectrum. And then as it passed across the face, it would go from red to yellow to green to blue to violet, and our cooler colors became the shadows. That sounds great in theory. It's incredibly complex, and that's where our kind of partnership with the technical teams and the RenderMan engineers to kind of come up with ways to actually control this was the next 6 months of the process.
Great. And Bill, what about the outlines and hands in Soul? I'm curious about the effects side of that. That's still a stylized view. I'm guessing Houdini and that kind of stuff was used for that work.
Yeah, so we had a tool that had been developed, and I'm actually blanking. If anybody knows, please jump in. But I'm blanking what it was originally designed for. But basically, we call it a silhouette tool. It was developed in Houdini by a guy at Pixar, Fernando, and it basically takes in screen space the outline of the character and creates a piece of geometry in Houdini that you can use. And there was a basic same story that Ian told. This was something that we kind of found naturally through the process needed to be part of the characters in certain areas. And again, I'm in effects, I'm not in characters. Maybe Pete, you can fill in a little more, but it was this evolution of figuring out where on the character the outline should be, and working in this kind of 3D space with this 2D approximation of where we wanted those lines to be it was a real challenge between tools, between characters, effects. We all kind of put our heads together and really took little baby steps towards what the right look was. And then in the end, the character team really like took Houdini in, took this tool in, and really just spent tons of time focusing on how to get these temporally consistent lines that had nice fall off on them and were really balanced within the characters, just in a subtle enough way to hint at, you know, the thing that we all wanted, and I think Pete was shooting for from the beginning, this kind of outline feeling around characters that I think, you know, you go back to all the way in I think you reference Dalmatians all the time, Pete, but you know, that kind of 2D hand-drawn feeling. So like Ian said, it was this huge collaboration between everybody, but we did have a little tool to begin with that helped us there, and then everybody worked towards that goal once we were naturally finding what that stylization needed to be.
Awesome. Pete, did you want to add anything else to that? Or I thought Bill was great as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know if you were going to talk about this, but I feel like in what we do, stylization is in CG is kind of like being the patient and the therapist at the same time. You have to first determine, like, what is it that I feel, you know, how do I grab a hold on that? And then you have to kind of figure out why. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, I think you have to be able to defend your choices, and you have to communicate it to others, especially if you work on a team with 200 or 300 people. And then you have to be able to dissect it down. So it's, you know, a lot of times if you're painting or drawing, you'll just do things kind of instinctively. Of course, with the computer, you have to be able to analyze what's at the root. How am I going to produce this across time consistently so that it all adds up into something? So like I say, it's a weird process of kind of balancing and switching back and forth from gut to intellect.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess in that vein, Deanna, I mean, you're the character art director on Luca. What did you come into Luca knowing? I mean, what was the style of Luca that you were all working towards? Is that something that you can easily answer?
Yeah, I should be able to. I mean, we worked really, really hard at the beginning, and this is where our production designer, Daniela Strichleva, was incredible at really defining those themes of childhood, summertime, friendship. And once we had those themes, and that's always key, of course, is to figure out, okay, well, what's the feeling then that these evoke? What are we trying to say with these designs? And that was playfulness, expressiveness, directness. And a lot of things inspired this. Of course, the boldness and fearlessness of children's drawings. We knew, because this film was being told through the lens of a child, that was a really important inspiration for us. And again, that's what really inspired those bold shape choices, but also because a bold shape choice is a beautiful platform for rich textures. And this idea of rich textural quality was really inspired by Enrico. Our director does a lot of traditional art and has a very distinct personal style. It's very gestural and perfectly imperfect. There's a lot of hand of the artist, and this is something we wanted to implement absolutely everywhere. And that meant avoiding the computer perfect, avoiding the straight lines, the sharp corners. And again, we did a lot of research into those really beautiful, rich textures. So that's really where we started. And I think what Luca did very, very well was that cohesiveness. Everyone understood what the design language was. We were able to communicate that very clearly. I mean, where characters were concerned, there were nine principles that we pushed. And everything from props to sets to the animation followed these principles, and everything complemented each other. So when we start talking about stripping away complexity for the sake of simplification, and what happens when you strip out too much and something breaks and the audience says, well, that's not what skin looks like, that's not what water looks like. When you build a world that's cohesive, you're telling the audience what the design is. You're putting stakes in the ground, so they won't question if everything follows, it lyrically follows the same rules. And again, I think that's something we did very, very well on Luca.
Oh, you absolutely did. I love the look of it, and I love the film. David, coming to you for Luca, from your point of view, what were some of the perhaps more technical challenges of creating imagery that stayed in that stylized world? I mean, I'm thinking things like shadow edges and is it called the shadow fringe?
Yeah, shadow fringe. That's for sure. It's actually based on kind of similar technology, or like as what Ian was talking about with kind of the soul, the soul kind of color ramp through the characters. And it's interesting. It just like comes from these principles that Dee was talking about. It's like this kind of rich texture, this kind of color that we wanted to put in all the frames to get this feeling of summer and to get kind of this eye of the child kind of thing. And this this avoiding the computer perfect, you know, like if you look at a shadow, right, like a cast shadow on something, it has a gradient edge kind of in the penumbra, like that's what you get. And that was definitely like gradients everywhere. If you look on Luca and you find a gradient, I'll give you $10 because we fought really hard to get rid of them because they were part of this computer perfect that I think Enrico really wanted to kind of get out. And so, you know, just synthesizing all these things, we saw some kind of reference illustrations that had this kind of beautiful glowy shadow edge that had kind of like brush stroke texture in it. And so, you know, we worked with the RenderMan team and they helped us out to figure out how to actually like run arbitrary OSL shaders on shadows, taking in information of how far you are from the shadow edge. It's kind of a lot of like RenderMan kind of math that went into this. And what we were able to do is like texture it and kind of just totally artificially like jam color around the edges. And it's interesting, this kind of idea of cohesion and this idea of making it all fit. Like when we first started, we used like really explicit brushstroke textures and that were really grainy and had a lot of tooth because that's what we saw in the illustrations. And it like totally didn't fit. It looked like a pasted on, you know, thing, and it was cool. It hit the reference, but it took you out. And so like the kind of the version of that you see in the film hopefully like captures that essence of that, you know, that beautiful kind of purposefulness of it, and the color of it, and you know, but you know, in our own way that kind of fits into that more immersive, more like kind of 3D framework, which everything else, you know, lived in. I mean, the other big thing, maybe to speak to some of what Bill was talking about, that comes to mind is the water. You know, it's like all these same principles of like simplification and taking things out, and how do you make something like water that is like naturally extraordinarily complex, like visually, right? Fit in this world of these characters with these, you know, bold shapes. And so we did a lot of work to take our realistic water models and like strip out basically frequencies of water to just kind of understand each one and then build them back up. And so we figured out what frequency of like, you know, a water surface generates you that really like kind of sinuous edge, and what frequencies you can layer on to get like triangular peaky shapes when you shine lights on them. And like, so stripped it down and built it up kind of really purposefully. And I think basically if you were to talk to all the departments, like to this kind of notion of cohesion, every department has its own version of that story of like stripping down and kind of understanding and kind of really like purposefully building back up, which, you know, hopefully like, you know, shows in the movie. And I remember I read a review that said like, oh, the water looks hyper real, you know, like, wow, the water's amazing. It looks so real. And it's like, the water doesn't look real at all. And like the kids don't look real at all. Like nothing in the movie looks real, but like, I take it as a compliment because I think it points to what Dee was talking about. It's like, it all fits together, right? It all fits together and kind of achieves that feeling. So,
you can't help but take that a little. I mean, it's good you take it as a compliment, but yeah, when people like say your stuff looks so real, first of all, you're right, it doesn't. But it's always a little bit of like, oh, wait, sorry, oh.
There's one thing that you guys keep hitting on it's this idea of stripping away complexity for the sake of simplicity. But I feel like at Pixar, it's deceptive simplicity. It's actually not simple at all. One of the hardest things to do is to pare something down, and it takes so much effort and so much thought. And we talk about, sacrificing believability, but again, it comes back to that deceptive simplicity wherein we're trading in realism for richness. The richness is still there. It's just a very sophisticated way of going about things. When I think of Luca, people say, oh, well, Luca's head is a ball. It's not, though. It's kind of like a cube with the edges shaved off. And the Chars folks, I mean, the modelers are brilliant, and they build in all of these subtle planes. They're all there, but they're so beautifully, the transitions are so gorgeous. He just looks like a ball. His skin, there's no pores, nothing like that. We traded in all the pores and capillaries and things for these rich layered textures, and it's so nuanced, but it's complex. It's just a different kind of art-directed complexity, really.
Yeah, Ricky Nirva, who is a production designer on Up, used to call it simplexity.
That is perfect. I wish I'd known that earlier. That is perfect.
That's so true, I'm glad you put a fine point on it. That's the big thing, that in my department we always struggle with so much, is that we throw away things in order to match the rest of the kind of level of detail in the film. But you have to very carefully categorize, like Dave said, what those things are and what you're throwing away and keeping. And I actually believe that stylization is way harder than realism at this point. It used to be that realism was hard because computation. Now stylization is and keeping your audience engaged. And to go back to the other thing that you were saying, Dave, it feels to me when somebody says, this is how I read, when somebody says, your stuff looks so real, I hear that as, I believed what you put on the screen as the thing that you wanted me to believe it to be, right? And that means like we did our job. We all 300 plus of us who were like trying to figure out what to add and what to throw away made the right choices.
Yeah, it's all about believability. I mean, everybody is kind of commenting on that in the chat too, where it's about the believability. But the hardest thing I think early on in a show is just getting the skin shading right, because just like you said, Deanna, like you can look at reference, and we do our homework. Pixar is famous for the research that we put into every show that we produce, but then it's a matter of just peeling back those levels of complexity until you get that appeal and that believability at the same time, and that balance of appeal and believability in a way that's going to play throughout the whole film.
I want to jump on something I think Pete mentioned, which is what a production designer described it as, simplexity. Was that right, Pete?
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually curious. I mean, this is a bit of a question as a journalist. I've said stylization versus photorealism. Simplexity is mentioned there. I'm sort of curious within Pixar how stylization is referred to, if at all. I mean, does it get called non-photorealistic rendering, NPR? Does it get called 2D versus 3D? Is there a way that the language is described, or is it, as you say, just, whatever the needs of the story are or the needs of that scene are?
I mean, we've gotten ourselves in trouble by trying to talk about it, because you can use these words that mean something different in one person's head versus another. And so I think more often than using words, we'll just hang up pictures, images, and go, see how the texture is going here? That's what we're looking for. But with the simplicity of form that is going on here, and sometimes it's live action films or a lot of stop motion, puppet films get referenced often, two-dimensional hand-drawn stuff. So yeah, it's really, I think when you're talking about visuals, you got to have the visuals to point at to know that you're talking about the same thing.
Yes, and ironically, when you're talking about stylization, we start with researching the real thing. You know?
Yeah.
So you kind of start there. There's one way to hang your hat, and then through that you can take, okay, well, what's the essence of this, and what do we want to strip away? But oftentimes, again, reference is rooted in reality. So
Awesome. Ian?
I was going to say that as Pete kind of hinted at, like the nomenclature a lot of times gets us in trouble because you know, one person can say one word and think another thing, you know. So sometimes saying something is based off of plausibly based lighting and shading is one way of thinking. It doesn't necessarily look photorealistic, but it's you know, based off of a school of thought that's like very technically rooted. Maybe that's one way to look at it, but like as artists, I think we're more intent on thinking of the end goals and kind of what moves us and what motivates us.
We've made complex diagrams with arrows pointing to things with words in them and hung them up in art and in effects reviews and all kinds of different things, just because that's such a big thing. You say a word and everybody has a different idea in their head. So like Pete said and Ian said, you make a picture, but then we also draw a line and attach a word to that picture. So we all kind of start talking about it together. Not all the time, but you know, in cases where like, we did this on Piper. I'm thinking of that, where we had diagrams of what the water line was and what the wet part of the sand was and what the drying but still slightly wet part and what the part above that. So we like had lines and labeled everything to talk about, you know, things in a way that everyone understood the same thing. And it's still, everybody still gets confused.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely remember early on Luca, like this pre-production process and this exploration, like I think that process is really like a fight for language, you know, so you can figure out how to talk to each other. You can figure out what that shorthand is. I mean, when I think about like, well, like this assertion, which I totally believe that actually like nowadays photorealism is probably easier. It's because we have a shorthand and like you kind of know, if someone tells you like, I want a room and it looks like this and it has this color and it's this and here's some reference, like we could hit that out of the park, you know, right away, like very easily, you know, but you don't have that, right? When you're searching for a look and everything's open and you have these conceptual goals and these feelings that you're trying to express. And so, I don't know, like I definitely remember early on just generating imagery to elicit a reaction, to try and figure out what people were talking about. I remember in the subject of skin shading, I always remember DLM talking about succulents. We wanted things like succulents and fuzz, like, yo, so we talked about like cactuses.
Yeah, it's always like, well, we want the skin to be succulent. And they were like taste good or like the plant?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
That was me. I was confused. I was like, we want it to taste good, like no, it's a cactus. You know, but like, so, you know, and we got there, right? Like you have to get there. Every show has to get to the point where we have that understanding, right? But it's not simple, you know, getting that is a lot of like mind melding, a lot of collaboration, a lot of work. It's like amazing work, right? It's like the best work, you know, kind of small teams partnering and just figuring out unknowns. Like that's the coolest stuff.
And I think the artist going there, you know, is especially like in the art department, when you have these, you know, directors that and production designers that just let you go free, you know, do what you want, especially in the pre-production time. On Soul, it was the wire sculptures. On Luca, I did a bunch of collage. But one of my favorite things to do at the beginning is shock the system. Like, look at this. What do you think? You know, because all I'm trying to do is, like you guys have been saying, get a reaction, a strong one. And I'm not afraid of a negative strong one either, because knowing what you don't want is just as important as knowing what you do want. But generating a conversation, that's really my job. I just want to start a conversation, get people talking and listen, because eventually through the conversation, we find out what we want.
I think what you were just saying, Deanna, is super, like, again, when you start out, I think, like I was talking about story and Dumbo and everything, you think, oh, people come up with these rules of design and then intellectually, and here, this is how we're going to do this. Not how it happens. It's very organic. Just thinking about Up, for example, we were drawing a lot of different things. I think it kind of grew out of character. We were like, Carl is this kind of guy who's solid and stiff, and he wants to stay put like a big square. And like, oh yeah, kind of square. And then in contrast, his wife Ellie has got this kind of upward shape. She wants to lift to the sky like a balloon. And so you have these upward teardrop shapes. And then, oh, okay, this is interesting. It came out of drawing. It came out of just doing it. Then when you get to other smaller choices, like even the rock shapes in the film, the rocks on the Tepui, those reflect those same shapes, the squares and this, even the picture frames in the background. And when there are pictures of Carl, they're squares, and when they're Ellie, they're more like oval. So, you know, a lot of those choices really grow organically out of the work. And then, kind of like I was talking about being a patient and the therapist at the same time, you're putting this stuff out there, and then you're also analyzing and going, this is what we want more of.
Brilliant. Guys, I thought we might turn to some of the questions from attendees, and there's been some great ones sent through. I feel like some of them have been answered in different ways by the comments so far. But one of them I wanted to ask was from Samuel Schultes, who asks, could you elaborate more on how the individual facets of a style are worked out and decided upon, like deciding on artistically placed hair or randomly generated hair, realistic shadows or unrealistic shadows, soft mouth shapes or hard mouth shapes? Does anyone want to tackle, you know, some of those individual style choices?
Well, I'll kick it off because it was sort of related to what I was just talking about, of discovering it, I think, both just by feeling things out, trying things like Deanna was talking about, thousands of drawings, thousands of paintings. And it's not just like you think of this one morning and there it is. It's a lot of trial, just trying different things and not being afraid to be wrong, and see what people respond to based on the emotion that's inherent in what you're doing. And then working around with a lot of people and seeing how they interpret those things. I remember on Soul, you know, we had this idea that the earth is full of texture and complexity and detail. And the further you go up into different zones of abstraction, it becomes more and more pure. So there's less angles, less texture. It just becomes like a point of light if you went all that way up. And we kind of represent that as they're on that slide walk going up, that characters just reduce down into nothing. Well, just a point of light. So I forgot why I was telling the story now, but that's kind of the way we were. Oh, so then, yeah, then you get into like, okay, so where are these characters? They're not all the way in the completely abstract. They're souls. They have some representation of a person, not their looks and the skin texture and all that. So we want them to be simple and rounded and sort of foggy and ethereal, which is a lot of the research we did in what different cultures feel a soul is. You know, they'll say ethereal, non-physical, non-representational. And so of course, we need to put something on screen. So we needed something, but we tried to hint at that. So anyway, I guess, where was I going? It's just a process of kind of finding things and then intellectualizing, but not starting with the intellectualizing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Well, what struck me from that question was the mention of, you know, mouth shapes. How round do they get? And this was something that these were questions that we had with Luca. And we've kind of circled this already, wherein you have what you know what you want it to feel like, right? If you look at my earliest model sheets for Luca, there are mouth corners. There are some, they're not as round as when you see them in the film. They were done early on. But as we moved forward and learned more about what we were wanting to say, and became more confident, we again established that design language and we applied it to everything. The rounding of the mouth corners came from this idea of no computer perfect, no straight lines. There aren't any straight lines in the set. We don't have any in Luca. So yes, avoiding straight lines, avoiding sharp corners because of the youthfulness. We wanted things to feel, like Pete said about the Soul world, more pure, more charming, more innocent. And shaving those corners and implementing rounder shapes lent itself very well to that feel. So that's really how we make these decisions. It all comes back to, okay, let's just remember, how do we want this to feel like? What are the main themes? Let's get centered, remember what the center is. And what's great about what was amazing again about Luca is that everyone got the memo. Everyone was on the same page. Everyone had this information. So it was wonderful even when I transitioned from art into animation to pass the torch and prepare a presentation for animation and say, look, this is where we've been. This is why we've made these decisions. And now let's make sure the animation complements these decisions as well. And with that information at hand, the animators could go ahead and experiment and do their brilliant work without, reinventing the wheel. I just didn't want them having to go back there and make the same mistakes and rediscover the same things that we already have done in art. So the key there is just communication and spreading the word.
Deanna, you're reminding me on Soul, the reason I started talking about the two different extremes, you have the complexity and then the very simple. When we did cloth, and this wasn't something that we intentionally set out to do, but the simulation department said, okay, I understand your guidelines here. It's going to be textured and tactile down here, and it's going to be pure and simple up there. So maybe instead of doing the cloth the way we normally do, which would be to get rid of all these tiny little wrinkles and make it much more bold and graphic the way we've always tried to approach the cloth, let's embrace all the texture and all the noodly folds and details. And so they came forward with this plan that was completely different than the way now whether you see this in the movie or not, I don't know. But for us, it helped exaggerate the very thing that we had talked about in the broad. Now this is in the detail. And I think every department, if you're really thinking, Bill's done that, Ian's done that, everybody kind of tries to figure out, okay, using the tools that I'm working with, how can I help drive home this design idea?
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete and Deanna, for that. I'm going to jump to another question. This is from Tessa De La Fonte. I hope it's not too much of a doozy, and you can all say, no, this has never happened. But she wants to know, has there ever been a stylistic shift well into the pipeline? And I guess that means a late change in the look and feel. Is anyone able to jump in there?
I remember one super team we were working on for a long time, and at some point JL came in and basically told Sanjay, I want it to look more like your art. And on a short, our schedules and budgets and everything are substantially reduced. So we had been working within a pipeline that was kind of structured for us, and characters were leading in a very specific direction that was the path of least resistance to get the visuals up on the screen. And Sanjay didn't realize it, but along the way he'd been making concessions that was eroding his stylistic sort of vision for the short. And JL came in and basically said, it's okay, let's put a little more effort and time into getting this to look like your art, Sanjay. And we did, and it was a big deal, in particular for characters and somewhat for effects. But we did take a step back, and we tried to find a way to get the technology to match closer to what Sanjay's 2D art was in his books.
Anyone else remember any other projects where things like that changed, well into the original concepts?
I mean, all the stories I have are more like slight adjustments or maybe bigger adjustments, but it's usually out of kind of push and pull from different people. I think generally as I mean, it was Deanna was saying earlier, like you don't, or Bill, anyway, sorry. Somebody was talking about the idea of not popping the audience out of the reality that the sort of web that you're creating. So a lot of times we'll start too extreme, we'll start with something pretty far out and then kind of nudge it back. Sometimes I feel like we nudge it too far back, but nonetheless.
Yeah. I've never been part of something where usually on the projects I've worked on, again, that visual language is well in place and we move along and it develops a little bit more as we discover things, but it's pretty consistent. There are times though where something's built into the story that's stylistically different and it's its own entity, like Pete on Inside Out, the abstraction sequence. So cool, and with Luca, it was the dream sequences, which are a departure. Still encompassing the visual language, but pushed even further, with the round clouds. But I'm sure, Pete, you can speak much more to the abstract sequence in Inside Out, but that's what I can think of there.
Well, we'll jump to another question. This is probably slightly another doozy, but I think it's interesting. Someone's asked, at what point in hyperrealism in animation do you think an animated background or character begins to cross over into uncanny valley territory? And I guess what they mean there is if it's super photoreal, it has a certain feel, but can cross over to that uncanny valley thing. Does anyone want to have a stab at, discussing that hyperrealism and uncanny valley relationship?
I guess oh, go ahead, Pete.
No, you go.
Well, we've talked a lot about kind of the believability and theme, and I think anytime something takes you out of the experience, believability-wise, you may have crossed over over to the uncanny valley. That's what kind of comes to mind. The other thing, our projects are so complex and there's so many talented people working on it that by necessity, everybody kind of drills down and focuses on what they're responsible for and what their skills and talent and they really focus in on that. And sometimes there's the necessity to remind everybody of the bigger picture, how it fits into the picture at large. And if you lose that objectivity, or if somebody isn't there to help you provide that objectivity, then you might go, oh, well, this shader, I see what it looks like in real life, I will apply this. So if you imagine Luca with pores, that would probably not, that would probably bump. Same thing, with Job. Job definitely went through that process. So yeah, it's all about believability for me.
I was going to say, if you look up Uncanny Valley, the chart, you get, so it's abstract over here and like photoreal here. What you get is the closer you get, the more relatability goes up until you get close to it, and then it does this big drop, right? So I think for most of us, the solution to that is to nudge that way, away from photorealism, to get more stylization, more. And I feel like Deanna talked about this too, the idea that abstraction, well, okay, if you look at a caricature by Al Hirschfeld, he'll do these just very simple lines, and it looks more like the person than they do. I don't know how he does it. It's just choices, and it's taking away all the stuff that gets in the way of that read. And so I feel like animation can do that times 10. You can do it through movement, you can do it through surface textures, through lighting, all these choices of getting rid of all the complexity that I don't really want to pay attention to, and then focus in what is left on the things I really want to make a statement about. It's almost like taking, I don't know if you've done this, like you take a bunch of carrots, if you make soup, it's like, yeah, it's carrot soup. But if you distill them down and you just keep them on the pot, keep them on the stove for a day and evaporate out things, it becomes this like super condensed, super tasty carrot soup that is like explosion of carrot taste. And that's, I think, what we're after with animation.
There's another component to the whole thing too that dovetails into all of it, and in effects, it really rings true. But I think it's totally true for all the other stuff too. The uncanny valley for me is very clear when things are in motion. If something is going to fall into the uncanny valley, it reveals itself instantly when you start to watch that thing in motion. You can have a painting that would clearly fall into the uncanny valley, but it's accepted wholesale by the viewer as a still frame, right? The second you try to add a temporal component to that, you move that thing, one or the other is going to break down. You could have done an amazing painting that doesn't work in motion because the pores are huge, and when you see those move, you don't believe them on a character's face, or any other permutation of that. But I think that's something that I'm sure there's a lot of people who've talked about it. I haven't actually read about it much, but I've kind of come to these conclusions in trying to make things like fire stylized, but also have the audience believe it, right? There's a certain thing you can do painting-wise with fire that works great. But if it doesn't move like fire, no one's going to believe it, right? So it's really these two things that make up the uncanny valley to me, the temporal component, but then also just in general, the stylistic component.
Absolutely. Deanna, do you want to finish off just with one thing?
No, I love what Bill said. There was something that we were circling for Luca in animation that's similar, where one of the things we realized was over-polishing was our enemy. Now, not imposing or getting the characters on model, we could polish all day for that. But it was over-polishing the animation, because in blocking, it had this really nice, dynamic, playful feel, this nice juxtaposition between areas of high energy movement and then quiet. And it was this lyrical quality that really echoed Enrico's sensibilities, and it was working. But when the animator would go away, and this was in pre-production before we really started working on the sequences, the animator would go off and polish, it would soften everything, and suddenly the way the character was moving did not complement the dynamics of the design. So this idea that, well, in order for our characters to seem alive, they have to be moving all the time. Sometimes the animator would leave a drift, and we learned very quickly, cut that out. Take it out, strip it away. It's okay for our characters to pause. They won't die. We found other ways to keep them alive. Yeah. So yeah, very cool.
Awesome. Well, I'm afraid I have to wrap it up there, and I'm also very hungry for carrot soup, thanks to Pete's comments. But listen, thank you everybody for tuning in, and thank you so much for your chat comments and questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Thank you, of course, to the panel, Pete, Deanna, David, Ian, Bill. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you. I think I'm going to go away and watch Soul and Luca again. So thanks very much, everybody. See you later.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.